Hello and welcome to this three-part tutorial on creating a holographic display type of effect that you see me sometimes do in my videos, and it's like all the rage right now in sci-fi movies like Avatar and commercials and stuff. It's a useful thing to be able to create, so I thought I'd go in depth on how to do something like this, and I figured it will be three parts because I want to go into the different aspects of, first of all, creating the assets for the hologram. Like we're going to make everything from scratch. We're not going to use any pre-made artwork. And then in the second video, we'll cover the tracking and the way to just get everything to animate and lock onto the features in the original plate, which is kind of the whole thing that makes it look like that type of holographic effect. And then the final video will just finish things up with just the compositing part of the process and just making things look right and making it into a complete visual effect that you're ready to show to people or put into your short film or whatnot. So let's get going with the first part of this and create the assets for the hologram. The way that mine usually looks is it's made up of three parts. There is this glow that's coming from the screen itself, that where it's emanating from, the whole hologram. Then there are these rays of light that kind of form the initial burst of where the hologram is pointed. And then there's whatever the actual display is. Like sometimes it's that cube, and in this case it's this flat panel that'll have an element coming out of it. So to make these three assets, let's make a solid. And I'm going to make the solid square and kind of a blue, light blue color. And the reason I'm making it a square as opposed to the full size of the comp is because I don't really know. I know it's going to be mostly vertical, but I don't know the exact shape. I want to play with it, so it's nice to make a square so I have the freedom to just kind of do whatever shape I want. But I'll duplicate this solid 2 times, so I have my 3 solids for my 3 elements, and then I'm going to pre-compose each one. I'm going to press Command Shift C to pre-compose. I'm going to leave all attributes in this main composition, which I called main. That's what I usually do. That's where the full finished shot is going to be contained. But this first element is going to be called screen glow. That's the thing that's going to be on the screen. The second one, I'm going to pre-compose the same way, but call it rays. Those are going to be the rays coming out of the screen. And the third one is going to be the panel. So we have the beginnings of our 3 elements. So let's go in order of difficulty from the most annoying, difficult one to the easiest, starting with this panel. Let's figure out what it's going to look like and how it's all going to work and animate. So I'm going to select the solid in this comp and double-click the rectangle tool, which will draw a rectangle around the entire composition. Now I'll double-click one of the points and it creates this transform tool. I'm going to hold Command and pull one of the sides to symmetrically make it narrow in the middle. Double-click off of that. I can take these 2 points, take them down. I'll hold Shift so it just travels up and down instead of left and right. And now I'll go in and maybe... Oh, you know what? I'll select one of the points, use the arrow keys to go right a certain number of times, like 4 times, and do the same thing on the left, keeping things symmetrical. And now I'll introduce some asymmetry. I'll hold Command and Alt to add a point here, and add a point here, and then select the first one and delete it to create like a cutoff wedge. And I'll make a bigger version of that on this side to just kind of keep things interesting. And maybe I will do like a little series of wedges here by just creating another mask with the rectangle tool. Make it real narrow like this and tell it to subtract rather than add. Then I will select the mask itself, duplicate it by pressing Command D, and then hold Shift and press the down arrow 1 time to just move it down a certain amount. Then Command D again to duplicate and Shift down to bring it down again. So I've got these 3 identical wedges. I'm just trying to come up with some sort of sci-fi display, interesting look. That's an improvement on what I had here, which kind of looks like tombstones. So it's always good to learn from your mistakes and improve things for next time. So let's see. Let's add an outline the way I had in my original video. Because it's a series of masks, I can't use the generate stroke effect. I have to use the layer style for stroke that adds a red stroke. But I'm going to go in here and change it to white, or the color of this, and then like make it much lighter, or something like that. And make it a little thicker, 4 pixels. That probably works. And that's going to be the backdrop for everything, but we're going to have things written on here, but not much. So I think it might be boring if it's just a blue, solid blue background. So I'd like to add like a texture, like a sort of animated element of these like streaks, you know, something that would look like some sort of display or like an imperfect transmission. So I'd like to create these stripes from scratch. I'll make a new solid, and I'll keep it the width of the whole comp, but I'll make it only 50 pixels tall, and I'll make it white. And let me turn off my original panel so we can just focus on this. So this is going to be how all the stripes look. So I think if I can get this stripe to behave and do whatever I want, just the one copy of it, I can then just duplicate a bunch of them and they'll just be a bunch of streaks. But I just want it to travel up and down like this, just kind of randomly. And if I keyframe this, I mean, it would take a while just to add all these keyframes. And plus, if I duplicate the stripe, then it's just they're all gonna do the same thing. So I'm better off using an expression. I'll press P here to open the position property, and I'm gonna apply an expression to this. If you don't know anything about After Effects expressions, you should really read up on it online. It's a very complicated topic. It's basically like writing code and programming, but we're gonna Alt or Option click on the stopwatch here, and we have this panel now where we can type in things to affect the motion of this layer in a procedural way. So if you ever tried any expressions or looked at any of that, like looked at any tutorials for expressions, you're probably familiar with the wiggle command. If you type wiggle and then in parentheses you type 2 numbers, it's gonna wiggle the layer around. The first number tells it how much can it change its position from one frame to the next. The other number tells it what's the maximum number of pixels it can travel ever as it wiggles. So in this case I put 2 so that it doesn't jitter around too fast. It just kind of moves smoothly and fairly slowly. And I put 800 because the whole comp is like 1080 pixels in size, and I want it to travel like 800 pixels from the middle. That will make sure that it goes all the way to the edges of the comp. So let's see what happens. If I preview, it does wiggle, but it kind of wiggles in every direction, and I don't want to see the edges. It just looks like a stick flying around. I would like to restrict the horizontal position and just keep it, and then just have it wiggle up and down. So how could I do this? I don't want to go into expressions because I don't even know how to teach that. I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on expressions. I just learned a couple of things and I look up the rest as I need it. But let's just look at a quick example of how to approach this very simple issue. I'm gonna cut my expression text here. I'm gonna paste it back in a minute, but let's just think about how this works without any expression. It just has the 2 values, the x and the y. This first number controls the x position. The second number controls the y position. And we could theoretically create an expression that just says, do nothing special. Just do what you normally do. The way that that would look is, I would add an expression that has a 0 in brackets, separated by a comma, from a 1 in brackets, because these numbers refer to the first 2 parameters you can change for the position property, the x and y. And if you wanted to just tell it to use these numbers, you would type value in front of each of these parameters, and then stick the whole thing into brackets, and then you're done. And what this is like a pointless expression that accomplishes nothing. It just says, do what you normally do. These numbers are now red, but really it just behaves normally. I can position this layer and the numbers will say where it is. But this is useful to us because we do want it to behave normally when it comes to the sideways movement, but we want to modify the up and down movement with a wiggle. So let's bring that wiggle back. I'll just paste that in. And instead of just using it as a command, we're going to assign the wiggle behavior to a variable. So I'm just going to type W equals wiggle and put a little semicolon at the end, which just makes this into a statement that just says W means wiggling this way. And now in this second line where we tell the layer what to actually do, we're going to leave this first part as is, meaning the X position, just do whatever this number says. But the second one, instead of value, we're just going to say W. That means, in this case, wiggle this way. And that gives us what we want. Now that when I preview, it's doing that wiggle, but it only moves up and down. Great. So now I just have to duplicate it a bunch of times. But if I do that now, this is going to be not just one stripe. Let me call this stripe 01. It's going to be a whole bunch of them. But if I decide that the wiggling is, goes too far or is not the right speed, then I will have to go into each stripe, open this expression, and change these numbers on each one. And I'd rather not do that. So instead, I'm not going to just type in a number here for the speed. I'm mainly concerned with the speed, I guess. I think it goes up and down enough, and I don't want to change that. But I'll add a null layer by pressing Command, Option, Shift, and Y. And I'm going to call it stripe control. And I'll add an effect from the expression controls collection here called slider control. And it's just a slider. And in the expression here, instead of this first number, I'm going to highlight it and pick whip the slider. So now it adds all the code necessary to tell it, just use whatever this slider value is. I'm going to click away. And now if I preview, the stripe no longer moves because the slider is at 0. If I type 2 here, it'll start doing what it was doing before. But now, no matter how many times I duplicate this stripe, if I want to change the speed on all of them, I just change the value of the slider. Another thing I'm going to want to control on all the stripes at the same time is how opaque they are, because I probably won't want them to be full white. So I'm going to press T on the stripe to open the opacity property. And on the stripe control, I'm going to duplicate the slider. I'll call the first slider speed, so I know what it controls. And the second slider, opacity. And then I'm going to open those guys here, opacity, and just add an expression to the opacity. And the expression is nothing other than saying, use whatever this slider says. The stripe has disappeared because it's only 2% opaque, because this is a 2. So I'll change this to 100. So anyway, all of that has been rigged up just so that we're ready to copy our stripe a bunch of times. So I'll highlight it and I'm just going to duplicate Command D a whole bunch of times till I have like 20 of them. So we got our 20 stripes. Let's preview. And of course that does look messy. So it's a good thing we can just change the look of this very easily by maybe changing this to 0.4 and the opacity to about 40%. That looks a lot more like what I envisioned with those interference stripes. Maybe even a little slower, like 3.3. That looks great. So that's our interference pattern. It's a whole bunch of layers all working together. So I'm just going to highlight all of the stripe stuff and Command-Shift-C and just pre-compose it into stripes. Just a composition that's called stripes. And now let's make our panel visible again and duplicate it and put it on top of the stripes. And on this copy, I'm going to remove that stroke effect because I think it adds a little bit of thickness all around. So I'm going to remove that because I'm going to tell the stripes to use that copy of the panel as an alpha matte, so that now the stripes only exist within the borders of the panel. And they look a little bright overall. So overall, the opacity of the stripes layer, I'm going to take it down to like, I don't know, 40%. Once again. So that now it's a nice little subtle pattern in the back of this thing. So that looks interesting. And that should serve well as the background of our panel. So I'll take everything, all of these elements that are just going to sit there the entire time, and pre-compose them and call this panel background. Oh god. Okay. Now let's start adding like information about stuff, the status of things. In fact, I'll type status here. Make it a little bit larger, and the status of things will be okay. And that's going to be very big, like this. And I guess let's put the okay into like a panel of its own, like a square. So I'll add a solid. I'll make it a smaller solid, but a square, 640 by 640. Give it some kind of different color that I hope reads. But we're not going to worry about too much about how things look right now, because that's going to be, we're going to save that for the final compositing stage. So with this solid selected, I'm going to choose the rounded rectangle tool. Just double click it so that it just creates the rounded edges on the square. Press S to scale it down like this, and raise it up a little bit. Maybe scale it down some more by holding Shift to keep its dimensions the same. I'll pull the OK above it. Maybe highlight both layers and use the Align tools to align them in the center. I'm going to parent the OK to the panel because it's like it's written on this green square. So I'm not going to mess with the OK. I'm just going to use the square to position it where I want it to be. They now work as one unit. And that looks cool. I guess there's a little bit of blank space down here. And here, as an example of when you're out of time or out of energy and you just don't care and you want to fill this space with something. For instance, I want to add some like binary numbers here. I don't necessarily want to keyframe any of that. And I don't really have time to figure out how to do an expression that will work, that will make that happen for me. But luckily, the internet is full of genius people that already have all these expressions covered for you. And one website that I would recommend if you want to learn about expressions, use motionscript.com. Just check it out. It's not a site that I think it gets updated very often, or I don't know if it's been updated in a long time, but it's just math, you know, like the information doesn't get old. So this guy, Dan Ebert, is really good at explaining how all this stuff works. And most importantly, he has ready-made expressions to use for whatever situation you might need to use them for. So I know there's one that I think I want to use called random binary block. So he's written this little bit of code that you could just copy and paste here. I mean, copy it from here and paste it into your own project. I'm going to make a text layer, but I'm not going to type anything. Instead, I'll open the property here in the text and source text and add an expression and just paste his code. And that creates all these numbers. I'm going to shrink them, well, highlight the layer and then shrink them to fit on my panel and align it to be in the middle. And luckily, it's too many numbers, but there's very convenient little controls in the expression. So we'll change the number of rows to like 3. Oh, don't need to press enter there. That looks good. Maybe the frequency also, I know it kind of changes slow, so I'll change it to like 8. So we got those little numbers. Beautiful. I'll make it a little bit transparent so that they're not like in our face. The less important the element, the more it should be kind of faded away. That looks great. So that's the look of our panel. Now, let's start animating things, because the idea in this shot is that, let me turn all these layers off, is that I have, in the previous shot, I just pressed the button on this thing, and right now the hologram appears out of the communicator. So let's animate whatever will happen with this panel. Now, the first thing is the panel will actually slide out of here and form. And I'm going to give that process about 8 frames, I guess, or 10 frames. So I'm just going to press Shift and then the page down key to go 10 frames forward. And at that point, this green square is going to like appear as a graphic. So I'm going to animate its scale. I'm going to press the stopwatch next to the scale, and then I figure about 6 frames, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, for it to kind of like form. So I'll add another keyframe to the scale property, and I'll jump back to the first one, unlink this proportional scaling, and then scale down its height until it's like a little thin sliver like this. And while I'm on this frame, I will also press Alt or Option left bracket, which will make sure that the layer starts on that frame and doesn't exist before that frame. So it goes like that. And then as soon as it takes on its full size, on the very next frame is when the OK is going to appear on the green square. So I'm going to hold Alt and left bracket to set the endpoint for that layer, but also I'll press T for its opacity property, keyframe that, go to the very next frame, and then take it to 0, go to the next frame to 100, 0, 100. And what that does is just give it this little like flicker that I like to do, just like that. You know, it just feels like something that appeared on a display. If you want to be, by the way, like super academic about this, you should take these keyframes and highlight them and right-click them and choose toggle hold keyframe, because if you were to stretch like how fast the flickering happens and add extra frames in between, then it would start fading in and out. But if you want it to still just like come on and off, then the keyframes should be held keyframes. Anyway, that's a digression that we do not need to get into. So we've got this happening, and then as soon as the OK has appeared, maybe like on the very next frame, the green square is going to travel forward toward us. It's going to be like a 3-dimensional thing that'll pop out. So now we're going to get into the 3D side of things. So I think I want to keep things organized. And whatever is not going to be 3D, I want to get it all out of this composition. So if you think about it, these little decorative numbers and the status are part of the background. Nothing's going to happen with them. So I'm going to actually just Command X them out of here, go into the panel background, and paste them here. So now nothing's changed visually, but they're all in this little thing. But everything that is in here, I'm going to press F4 to open my toggle switches here. And I'm going to make it a 3D layer. And now things have changed, because actually we've been looking through the custom view instead of the active camera. In our active camera, things still look normal. But actually we do want to be in a custom view here, because we want to look at it from some different angle. Because now, let me highlight these guys and press U to see where the keyframes are. Right from this frame, I'm going to press P to animate the position of this green square. So I'm going to add a keyframe there and maybe go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 frames. Add another keyframe. And here I'm going to just move this value, just raise it up to move this guy forward like this. So that's all there is to it. I think I want to make these, press F9 with these keyframes highlighted to give them an ease in and out. So that's what's happening. Maybe it goes a little bit forward, a little bit too much, so maybe like that. And another thing I'd like to do is to, as it moves forward, the green square should probably be, I was gonna make it like become a little bit transparent, but instead I'm just gonna make its transfer mode be like screen or something like that. Yeah, that way it already looks kind of like holographic, and ghosty. So, okay. Let's go back to our active camera view. So this element is pretty much ready to go. The only thing I'd like to do is it just cuts off here at the edge of the frame. So let's go into our background, panel background. And I'm gonna, on top of all these things, I'm gonna add another solid, make sure it's the size of the whole comp. And I'm gonna add a big rectangle mask to it with a little bit of the bottom cut off. And I'm gonna make its transfer mode stencil alpha. And what that does is whatever the transparency of this solid is, it's gonna act as an alpha channel, as a clip map for everything that's underneath, all the layers underneath it. So I'm gonna press M twice to open the mask properties and just feather that edge out a lot so that we have a nice soft kind of, you know, trailing off at the bottom. And that'll do it for this panel element. It's ready to go. Now here, remember, it's a 3D thing because the OK pops out of it and all of that. So, but here, it's a 2D layer right now. If I make it a 3D layer and go into my active camera and rotate it a little bit, it will rotate in 3D. However, when the OK is supposed to pop out of it, it doesn't pop out. It's like a 2D picture of the 3D animation on there. But if you toggle this little switch called collapse transformations, it'll kind of transfer all of the 3D information out into this comp. So it's a very handy way of, you could build like a whole 3D object inside of a different composition, and then here is going to act as this three-dimensional form. So it's ready for us to do stuff with it and, you know, apply tracking to it and all that kind of stuff. So let's move on. We took a long time to create this panel, but it's not going to be that difficult for the rest of the stuff. Let's figure out the rays. The rays are just going to be made out of an effect called, it's in the noise and grain section, and it's just called fractal noise. It's a very versatile thing you can use for a lot of different type of effects, but all we're going to do to it is just make it a little bit more contrasty, and then change its scaling. We're going to open the transform section here, uncheck uniform scaling so that we can make its width kind of smaller, and then make it very, very big vertically. I'm going to hold shift as I scroll through this so it goes really far. Just basically enough where there's no vertical details to it. It's just streaks that go all the way across the image. So that looks great. That looks like cool holographic rays of light, but it's just a still image right now. So I'd like to animate it. One way to do that would be to move this, to change this evolution property over time so it kind of, you know, undulates this way. But I don't want to keyframe it. Let's use an expression once again. And an easy way to do that would be to tell it to use some changing number. Well, one thing that's always changing is the time of the actual composition. So if you add an expression here and just type time, it'll just like use numbers from the time to change it. But it translates to about like 1/100th of a degree of rotation for every frame, and that's a very subtle change. It's too slow. So we'll just add times 300. We'll multiply this change by 300 times, and then in real time we got a nice, subtle but noticeable wavering pattern. So all we need to do now is just kind of give it nice soft edges. I'm going to add a mask, a big mask on top, and another one on the bottom, and I'll tell them to subtract. And the reason I'm doing two different masks, subtracting instead of one adding, is because I want them to have different levels of feathering. The bottom will be a little bit feathered, but the top will be feathered by a lot, because they're sort of, the rays are like falling off gradually. And then we'll just use the expansion parameters to get it as close to the edge as possible. That looks great. So there's our rays. They already exist in here. And finally, our screen glow, which is going to be nothing more than... I already made those little stripes, so I'll just stick them on top of this blue stuff and give them a add transfer mode and make them a little bit less opaque. And that should probably work. That should probably work okay. So that's it. We've got our 3 elements prepared, and we can now concentrate on making them fall in the right place and be tracked to the device in the scene. And we will do that in the next video. So see you in the next video.